Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be talking about a big, huge topic, and that is literally the national debt, the debt that the United States owes itself and other people around the world and other nations and those who have borrowed, those who have lent money to the federal government through the sale of bonds and treasuries and so forth. And we're going to be talking about this in juxtaposition to the way a lot of the politicians are thinking about the debt. A lot of the politicians don't seem to be bothered about the debt. They don't seem to be worried about the debt. In fact, many of them, it's almost as if they have a blind spot and they just don't even notice that there's this huge, huge elephant in the room, the national debt. They will talk around it. They'll talk beside it, on the sides of it, up, down. They just will not talk about it because they don't want to bring up that whole subject because everybody knows that either they don't have a solution or they don't want to implement the only possible solution. And either way, they're not getting it dealt with. And so, what does that mean to Christians as we look at the future? What does that mean to younger Christians in their teenage years, their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50, middle age up to 50? What does that mean to the younger generation when they reach the retirement ages in their 60s and 70s and 80s? What does that mean for them? Now, I think we're fairly safe to say that the looming national debt, which has now reached 34 trillion, I just learned through this article we're going to look at, that probably will not mean a lot to people who are already retired. It may mean something to them depending on what happens in the economy, but it may be the case that this won't be a crisis for another few years. And so if people are in their later retirement ages, this may not even be a factor for them. But for the younger generations, it already is a factor because the interest rate on the debt is just loading down our economy, and it's burdening the inflation rate and driving prices up, and it's just a mess. And it's preventing, right now, for example, a lot of young couples from buying homes. It's preventing a lot of people from buying cars. And we have, for example, in the news that people are holding on to their used car longer and longer today than they normally do. And so this is definitely affecting everything in our country. But we're going to look at an article of two politicians who work for governments, one the national federal government and the other a local state government of Michigan. And they're going to laugh and joke their way through the economy and a review of it, and they're going to bring out all the positive things that are happening in the economy and totally omit any reference to the looming national debt. So as Christians, how do we think about this? Do we have anything to say? Now, there are a lot of evangelical Christians, Bible-believing Christians, who say, well, we're not to concern ourselves with anything like what's going on in Washington, D.C., or our state governments. We're supposed to just mind our own business, live quiet and respectful lives, and not concern ourselves with these larger global national issues. In other words, take sort of an Amish approach to things. In other words, the Amish, and I've been to Amish country. I've been down to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Stayed at a bed and breakfast with a Mennonite family and walked through the Amish communities. And I've seen the Amish out in the fields, the whole family out in the fields harvesting their crops. And I've gotten an idea of the Amish community. They're very isolationist. They stick with their own business and their own property, and they really have nothing to do with the government. They have nothing to do with the federal and state and local governments, and they are very much isolationist, and they basically wash their hands of all concern about government. That is not a biblical position, by the way, And that is not how the Bible in its totality uh, tells us to live. We are instructed in the Bible to pray for our rulers in authority, and we're also to implement wisdom, which is found all over the Bible in Proverbs and in the New Testament and all over in the book of Psalms and all over the Bible. We're told to bring these truths to bear into the real world and do all we can and be responsible to help for the good of the city and to pray for our rulers. And if you're going to be praying for the rulers, if you're going to be working for the good of the city, then it stands to follow that you would also be participating in the common good of the city. And that is, you would be a board member or on the PTA board or the school board or the city council. You would try to bring the truth of God in His Word to bear on everything, every single issue that comes up. There is something that God has usually commented on in the Bible, spoken of, given principles for truths, wisdom that can apply to the situation. And we should do that in respect to the national debt and the way our government finances things. So we don't want to be isolationists. We don't want to stick our heads in the sand. We don't want to be those kind of people that we see in the Amish community in regard to government involvement. We want to be in touch with the government. We want to meet people where they're at, and we want to share the wisdom of God. And it can't get out in community unless we bring the truth of God into every sphere. So the Amish option is not really a viable Christian option for so many reasons, and we can go through a whole lesson in why the Amish are wrong in respect to involvement in government and leadership in our national government and state and local governments. But we won't get into that totally today, but I do want to look at this article that appeared in the Detroit News. So let me bring the article up, and it's written by Nolan Finley, and he's got some good points here. So I'd like to just simply cover some of this and show you, unfortunately, how a lot of politicians are just sticking their heads in the sand and pretending that the national debt is just really a nothing. So the article starts out, our debt-ridden economy is not healthy. So he's responding to the fact that a lot of politicians, particularly the current administration in Washington, Joe Biden, his administration, and the Democrats all over the country in different cities and states, they're trying to tell you that our government is doing the best it can and that our economy is healthy. Even though when we go to the grocery store, we find that food prices are higher. When we go to buy lumber, for example, at Home Depot, we find that building materials are higher, radically higher in some cases, and that everything that costs today is a lot higher than it was pre-pandemic. And we just see that every day. So we don't need the government and politicians to tell us that everything is fine when it's not. And we don't need politicians here in this picture. For example, we have U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen here, and Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan agreed the economy is strong and healthy without mentioning its ballooning debt. So they're smiling, they're joking, they're laughing, they're upbeat. They're saying, hey, everything's going great. And the problem is, as everyone knows, it's not. So they're trying to, this is called gaslighting. They're laughing, they're joking. And if you're saying, well, wait a minute, the economy is not so great. Oh, it is great. Don't believe your lying eyes. Don't believe what you see in the grocery store when you go buy food. Don't believe your budget every month when you tally up all your expenses. Don't believe all that. Don't believe when you go into McDonald's and a Big Mac is costing $6, $7, $8 for a value meal. That's not a value meal. It doesn't sound like a value meal to me. It's not a value combo meal. McDonald's used to be a place where you could go and get really cheap food that tastes somewhat good, and you could fly in and fly out and get your food and be on your way, and it wouldn't cost a lot. Today, if you go into McDonald's, the family of four, you're probably going to be spending above $25 to feed everyone in that family. So this is not cheap and fast food anymore. It's not even fast anymore because of the economy, again, that has forced these business owners to lay off workers because they force the business owners to pay these outrageous minimum wages. For example, out in California, McDonald's workers, by law, now must pay their workers $20 an hour. $20 an hour to hire a high school student or a young person to work behind the counter at McDonald's or in the restaurant at all. And so what that forces the McDonald's owners to do is to lay off workers and bring in the automatic ordering stations all over the McDonald's store so you can punch in your order, and that eliminates a job. So what they're doing is they're raising the minimum wage out there to $20 an hour for teenagers who work there and anyone who works there starting out. And then they'll say, okay, we'll do that, but then we'll eliminate half the amount of workers that we hire, and we'll automate the process of ordering. So it's actually eliminating jobs for younger people. And so that's why prices have to be raised, because to afford all of the government tinkering in the business world. So let me get into the article. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Michigan Governor Whitmer had a friendly chit-chat last week at the Detroit Economic Club, during which they marveled at the health of the U.S. economy. Again, this kind of, you might say, you would say gaslighting, just trying to pretend that things are not the way they are, and we can all see it. They have a vested interest in trying to sell us that things are better than they are, and they're trying to do it with all their heart. The problem is we're not buying it, and you shouldn't buy it either. It says inflation has slowed to near pre-pandemic levels, Yellen boasted. That is the numbers that the government uses, and you have to realize that the inflation formula has been adjusted over the last few decades to make it a lot harder to show high inflation. So when you cook the books in Washington and try to skew the numbers so that you can then spin them to the public when you're talking about inflation to make it look better than it really is, this is what you get. So these inflation numbers that the government gives you, first of all, have taken out a lot of the items that would show the real inflation level. So we are very skeptical about the government's numbers these days. And it's just the same way that happened during the pandemic. When you get numbers from the government, you're very skeptical of them. Well, wait a minute. What have they done to cook the books, to work the numbers, to say what they want to say? And that's what Janet Yellen is saying here. She's saying inflation has slowed to near pre-pandemic levels. She's also not saying that having gone through the rampant inflation, the prices are still at that level, but they're not going up as much as they were during the worst of the inflation. So again, putting this rosy face on all these numbers, you have to be very careful. And some of this signaling is just outright deceit. They're deceiving people with numbers and cooking the books. More people are working, again. You got to question that. And we've skated through a rocky 4-year period without a recession. Again, what do you mean by recession? The levels that they're now measuring things by is a very questionable level, and the threshold of what you call a recession is being, again, manipulated so that you take these numbers and you put them through certain formulas and you get the result, and the numbers they're looking at don't seem to match the reality on the ground. They're about as in touch with the real people of this country as Joe Biden is in touch with reality through his cognitive problems. Thank you very much. Whitmer added, for the $6.5 billion the federal government sent Michigan's way, money she is using to create a larger state government better equipped to manage the lives of its residents from cradle to grave. So he's alluding to the fact that Gretchen Whitmer loves a big government. I've talked about the problems with big government. Cradle to grave, that's a reference to socialism, cradle to grave socialism. Again, you have these two women who are in charge of a lot of power in this country, and they're trying to tell us that everything's great, and we know that it's not. Together, the two Democrats agreed the economy is strong and healthy. Well, that's great. They agree. They agree it's strong and healthy. The problem is just the average person can see that it's not the case. That is, except for the steady worsening terminal disease that neither breathed a word about during their upbeat exchange. The healthy economy was propped up by $1.7 trillion in deficit spending. Deficit. That is, spending that does not come from the revenue that comes into the government. So every year the government brings in a certain amount of money. This deficit spending of $1.7 trillion is over and beyond what the government brings in. So that's borrowing, spending in 2023, and an equal amount to 28% of the total revenue. So almost 30% of the entire U.S. budget last year was from borrowing, from debt. It wasn't brought. Now, normally, ideally, you would have a government that brings in a certain amount every year, and then you spend a certain amount every year, and you don't spend more than is brought in. And that's called a balanced budget. Well, we are constantly running a deficit in the United States, and that's what he's talking about here. 30%, almost 30% of the total revenue that we spend is borrowed in 2023. None of us would consider our household finances healthy if we were putting a quarter of our spending on credit cards that we never pay down. Earlier this month, the federal debt hit $34 trillion. That's a fivefold increase over the past 20 years. The Treasury reached that mark 5 years ahead of projections. So what that means is that our government, every year, consistently every year, we are spending way more than we're bringing in. And I've always asked the question, why can't we simply say to ourselves as leaders in Washington, why can't they say to themselves, look, we will not spend more than we bring in. We will not continue to borrow way far more, a third more than we bring in. So what they're doing is they're living off, they're spending 2/3 that are fine. That's fine to spend the 2/3 level amount of money for our expenditures in the U.S. government. But then they're adding another third from debt. They're borrowing money. And what this is causing is an increase in the national debt overall. So he's going to talk $34 trillion. Now, I was under the impression it was around 32, 33. I had heard 33 before, and now he's saying 34. And we can see that where this is headed. Now, the problem with deficit spending is that if it's done in an emergency situation, then we can deal with that. Our economy can absorb that. For example, during the pandemic, if we had to, and that's a big question mark, if we had to deficit spend during the pandemic years, then okay, we did it in an emergency situation, and then after the pandemic has died down and we're over that, the economy gets back up and running, and we quickly pay that debt, that deficit spending that we had during the pandemic years. We pay that down and we're back to a balanced budget. That's ideally what happens. Or if we enter into some kind of a war and we're in a war for 2 or 3 years or even 5 years, Then we deficit spend during the war. It's an emergency. It's not a normal situation. So then we get back to normal after the war is over, and we pay that down in 4 or 5 years, and then we're back to square one. So that's the way originally the deficit spending was supposed to be. But now what has happened is politicians have decided, well, no, we're going to deficit spend every single year. And so we're going to get into a habit of it, and we're not going to break the habit. We're just going to continue to do that as long as we can. And they've done that. And so what's happening now is they are doing this in non-emergency years. This is not an emergency time in our country. We're not in the pandemic years. We're over that. And so we need to begin to pay this down, but we're not. We're not paying our debt down. He says, in his 3 years as a spender-in-chief, Biden has added roughly $6 trillion to the national debt. $6 trillion with his American Recovery Act, so-called, where he's spending billions and millions of dollars, sending them to states for infrastructure and all kinds of things. Really? Was that totally necessary? Especially after we had just deficit spent during pandemic years? Was that totally necessary? No, it was not. But here again, the Democrats and the leftist liberals, they love to spend your money. And so they're going to continue until something or someone stops them, and nobody is. Now, it's not just the Democrats, though. Donald Trump, his predecessor and current rival in the presidential campaign, added $8 trillion over 4 years. So don't expect discipline to be touted on the campaign trail this year by any of the candidates. $8 trillion. So again, many of us questioned, why in the world do you need to send stimulus checks to everyone during the pandemic years? Well, their rationale was, well, we're closing down businesses. Yeah, that was a bad move. And people could see it at the time it was being done. Shutting down the entire economy was a bad decision. Instead of shutting down the economy, there should have been some kind of a plan to maybe ask companies, if they felt that there was a risk to their workers, to come up with a plan that would compensate workers for a certain time and something. But to shut the whole economy down and to lay everybody off and then expect the government to pay them their paychecks or a percentage of their paychecks to keep them going, it was a mess. It was a mess all around, and many of us questioned, why would you do such a thing? And Republicans did it, though. Trump did it. So it's not just a Democratic problem, although the Democrats are the cheerleaders, and they're the ones that are championing the deficit spending. It should be front and center. Per capita debt, the amount each America owns on behalf of the country, is now about $100,000. That's each person we owe, if you break it down per capita, up from roughly $61,000 at the start of the Trump's first term. So that's a staggering thought. If you take each person in the country and you put a debt amount on them, you will come to the conclusion that each one owes $100,000. That is outrageous. That is just outrageous. And there's no end in sight. The annual deficit is projected to hit $2.6 trillion by 2034. So the way things are going, it looks like we'll be spending $2.6 trillion over the amount that comes in every year by 2034, 10 years from now. Notice no one talks any longer about the magical point in the future when the revenue and expenditure lines meet. We've surrendered to permanently living beyond our means. That's what it comes down to, beyond your means. The deficit, and the Bible talks about, no man a debt except for the debt of love. We know that debt sometimes is permissible. For example, a house, you're building equity, so you're not going out there like credit card debt. But this kind of staggering debt is totally unacceptable from a Christian viewpoint. It's totally irresponsible. If you read through the book of Proverbs, Proverbs would lead you to believe, no, you can't do this. You can't run this up. It's disaster waiting to happen. The deficit, no matter how large, doesn't deter more spending. That's the problem. They just keep on plowing ahead. And just like we saw before, Gretchen Whitmer and Janet Yellen just keep on joking and smiling and saying the economy's great when we all know that that is not the truth. The deficit, no matter how large, doesn't deter more spending. Last week, the Senate passed a $98 billion aid package to Ukraine and Israel. Nobody asked, how are we going to pay for it? Well, there were a few people that asked that, but it didn't seem to faze anybody. It seems almost in poor taste to suggest cutting spending on existing programs to fund new priorities. The attitude in Washington is there's nothing we can't afford. It is almost to the point of they're addicted to this deficit spending. You know, they found a magical way that they can give the taxpayers everything they want in the form of programs and services and run up a massive debt at the same time, but defer it to the future to pay it off. It may be a way off, but the day is coming when the national debt will be a tangible thing in the lives of Americans. And that's what I mentioned at the beginning. It's the younger generations that are going to really feel this. A lot of the politicians will be dead and gone by the time the economy reaches the point where that debt level and that interest level cannot be paid. Mounting unmet obligations will ultimately slow business investments and raise interest rates. Servicing the debt will cost $870 billion this year and is projected to climb to $1.6 trillion in 10 years. $1.6 trillion in debt, in interest every year on our debt. That will mean either a lot less money available to pay for the government giveaways Americans have come to expect, or a lot more tax hikes. Whether it's Biden talking or Trump, expect to hear a lot of bragging this election year about how well one or the other managed the economy. But together, the Jenga tower they've added debt sticks to is getting nearer to collapse by the day. And that is what I've been saying, and that's what a lot of people have been saying for a long time. And here we're seeing the numbers, and they just keep going higher and higher and higher. And as Christians, we know this is totally irresponsible. It's totally foolish. And we are setting the younger generation up for a really miserable economy at some point in the future. It just seems like a lot of people just don't care. And we need to remember the words of Jesus, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Would you like someone to run up a debt for you to pay off in the future, 10, 20, 30 years from now? No, you wouldn't want them to be running up their debt and obligating you to pay. And that's what we're doing to the younger generations today. So we need to pray to God that there can be some sanity brought into Washington. We need to pray that these politicians will see the light and say, look, we can't just keep deferring this to another day, even though that's the easiest way. We have to deal with this, especially Social Security problem. The Social Security problem will dry up in about 10 years from now, and there won't be enough to meet the obligations. We need to deal with that. We need to deal with the national debt. We have to get our spending under control in Washington, and that's the Christian perspective. There is no other way to do it. So pray for that, and we'll see you back next week. God bless.